The heat had not broken in Dover for 7 days. 87 degrees by the brass thermometer nailed to the kitchen door frame, and the air inside the house at 210 South State Street had gone thick as wet flannel. The parlour curtains hung without stirring, the horsehair settee pressed warm against the palm. In the pantry the butter had gone to yellow oil in its dish, and the cook had given up on the bread and left the dough to its own slow rising, beneath a square of damp muslin. The cat lay flat on the boards of the rear hall, its sides lifting and falling as though the work of breathing were the only labour the afternoon required. On the veranda, the rocking chairs had been pulled closer to the rail where the elm threw its thin shade, and a pitcher of lemonade sat sweating on a side table, yet the rings it left spreading slowly across the varnish. Mary Elizabeth sat nearest the steps. Her sister Ida was beside her, fanning herself with a folded newspaper, now and then glancing toward the children running barefoot along the porch rails. Neighbourhood girls had come by, as girls did on such evenings, and the talk ran soft and unhurried, the way talk does when the heat has emptied a town of its sharper feelings. The box had arrived that morning from the hall table, white, oblong, gold script along the lid, tied with a ribbon of pink satin that had not crushed in the mail. A small folded note lay inside, written in a hand Mary did not know. With love to yourself and baby, Mrs. C. 6 words. A signature that was only a letter. And a box of chocolates, still cool enough from the shaded hall to melt slowly on the tongue. And within 3 days, 2 of the women on that porch would be dead. Good evening and welcome to the Bedside Historian. Wherever you are tonight, whatever hour your clock is holding, whatever weather moves against your window, I am glad you have come. If you would tell me in a quiet word where you are listening from, and what the time is there, I read every one of them, and the company is a kindness I do not take for granted. If these late hours in the older corners of history have become something that rests you, a gentle subscription helps the work go on, and I am grateful for it. Tonight we step back to the summer of 1898, to a porch in Delaware, to a box that had crossed 3,000 miles of track and telegraph to arrive on a hall table in a congressman's house, and to the woman in San Francisco who had packed it with her own hands, tied the pink ribbon, and walked it to the ferry post office as calmly as any other errand on any other afternoon. Her name was Cordelia Botkin. Chapter 1. The house on South State Street, Dover, Delaware, in the first week of August 1898, was a town that kept its rhythms by bell and by shadow. The courthouse bell marked the hours, the shade of the elms marked the afternoons, the porches marked the evenings. It was a small capital in a small state, and its most prominent houses stood along State Street in a quiet row, set back from the road behind low iron fences and flower beds that the summer had baked to a pale exhaustion. The house at 210 South State Street belonged to John Brown Pennington, a former congressman of careful reputation and stone-quiet dignity, and in that August it held more of his family than it had held in several years. The heat had not broken in 7 days. The papers had stopped remarking on it. By the second week of August it was simply the weather, the way hunger is simply hunger once it has settled in. The thermometer on the kitchen doorframe had climbed past 87 degrees on the afternoon of the 8th, and the rooms of the house had taken on that peculiar summer hush in which the walls seemed to be listening. The parlour curtains hung without stirring, the horsehair settee pressed warm against the palm, the piano in the front room had gone slightly out of tune in the damp, and no one had thought to call the tuner because no one had felt like playing. The house kept itself alive the way such houses always did. In the small hours before dawn, the cook had come in through the kitchen door and lit the range, and the first smell of the day was coal smoke and the faint sweetness of the milk warming for the coffee. By 6 the kitchen was in full labour, the flat iron heating on the back of the stove for the linens, the butter set out in its dish, the bread already shaped and rising under a square of damp muslin in the pantry. By 7 the upstairs maid was down with the chamber pots, and the slop pail went out the back door to the alley. By 8 the family had begun to appear in the dining room, in the order their habits arranged them. Pennington first in his morning coat, his daughters after him in the light summer dresses that the heat required, the children last and barefoot and only put into shoes when the day's formalities made it necessary. So Mary Elizabeth Dunning was 35 that summer. She had returned to her father's house in Dover in the autumn of 1896 after learning what she could no longer not know about her husband's life in San Francisco, and she had stayed. She had not filed for divorce. She wrote letters to John Preston Dunning every day, short letters about the garden, about her daughter, about small domestic events of no particular weight, and she sent them west as if devotion itself might at last be enough. She kept her mornings simple. She worked in the flower beds when the sun allowed it. She read in the afternoons. She was known in Dover as a woman of exceptional sweetness and steady moral character, and the town had absorbed her quiet unhappiness as towns do, with a tact that neither asked nor pressed. And her sister Ida Hanby Dean was 44 that summer, and she had come over that week with her 2 young children because August in a shared house was easier than August in a small one, and because the children loved their grandfather and their aunt and the long veranda and the long days. Ida fanned herself with a folded newspaper. She kept an eye on the children. She sat near Mary on the porch in the late afternoons and did not speak about her sister's absent husband because there was nothing to say that had not already been said quietly, many times, over many months. The mail came twice a day in Dover in 1898, and the hall table near the front door was where it accumulated until Pennington or his daughters went through it. There was always a great deal of it. Congressional correspondence came even to former congressmen. There were letters from relatives in Baltimore and Philadelphia, bills from the grocer and the coal dealer, circulars, a newspaper, a magazine folded in brown paper, small cards announcing births and deaths and visits. The table was crowded in the mornings and empty by dusk, and the household moved past it a dozen times a day without thinking of it, the way one moves past a clock. On the morning of August 9th, a white box arrived in the afternoon post. It was oblong, decorated with gold script along the lid in the word bonbons, and tied with a ribbon of pink satin that had not crushed in its long ride across the country. The brown paper it had come wrapped in lay discarded on the hall table beside it, and the address, in a firm feminine hand, was visible on the crumpled paper. Mrs. John P. Dunning, Dover, Delaware, the return address. Here in the same hand was a post office in San Francisco, no name above it, only the city. Mary Dunning lifted the box and carried it into the sitting room. She was a woman accustomed to letters from San Francisco by now, though the letters she usually received from that city were not sweet and were not signed. She sat down at a small table near the window and untied the pink ribbon. Inside the box, laid in rows that had shifted slightly in transit, were chocolate creams and oblong bonbons and chocolate drops covered in sugary sprinkles, and tucked alongside them a folded handkerchief of fine cotton, with the store tag from City of Paris still attached by its small string. Beneath the handkerchief lay a slip of paper, folded once, written in the same firm hand as the address, "With love to yourself and baby, Mrs. C." She read it, and read it again, and the sitting room held her in its warm, airless quiet while she considered the 6 words in front of her. She did not know the hand, she did not know the initial, but in San Francisco there lived a woman named Mrs. Corby, a friend of her husband's from the boarding house on Geary Street, a woman whose first letter to Mary had been gracious, and whose second had been gracious, and whose name began with the letter C. The baby could only mean her daughter. The handkerchief was a thoughtful thing. The chocolates were a thoughtful thing. The ribbon was a thoughtful thing. She did not yet wonder why the note had not been signed with a full name, because she could think of a dozen reasons that a woman writing across a distance might sign a note briefly. She had written brief notes herself, and she set the box on the sitting room table beside the open ribbon. She folded the handkerchief and put it on the table next to the note. She went to find her sister. The veranda that afternoon was the coolest room the house had, though cool was a word that did not truly apply to any part of that August. The elms along the street shed a thin shade onto the boards. The rocking chairs had been pulled closer to the rail, where the air moved a little when it moved at all. The lemonade sat sweating on the side table, and the children had stopped running long enough to drink it down, and had then resumed. The Pennington dog lay under the steps, panting shallowly. The cat had not been seen since breakfast. Mary brought the box out with her. Ida admired the ribbon and turned the lid to read the gold script. The children came up at once, because children know a white box when they see one, and a small hand reached in and took a chocolate, and another small hand took one, and Ida took several, and the neighbourhood girls who had stopped by on their walk home, Miss Millington and Miss Bateman, were offered one each, and accepted politely, and stayed a minute longer in the shade before carrying themselves on down the street. Mary herself ate 3. The chocolate was rich and slightly soft from the heat, and it melted sweetly on the tongue, and there was no bitterness in it, and no metallic edge, and no warning at all. Arsenic, when it has been carefully worked into a confection, carries no taste. It is as near to nothing as a poison can be. It does not announce itself in the mouth. It waits. The afternoon settled around them. The cicadas kept up their long dry note in the elms. A buggy passed on the street, its wheels grinding softly in the dust. and the driver touched his hat to Pennington, who was standing at the parlour window with a newspaper he had forgotten he was reading. In the kitchen, the cook had begun the supper, and the smell of onions in butter began to drift toward the porch, and Ida said something to Mary about the children's bedtime, and Mary laughed quietly and said the heat would put them down before any bell did. It was the kind of laugh the house had not heard much of in 2 years. It was the sound of a woman who had, for a moment, been remembered kindly across a distance. The first of the children began to complain of a stomachache at about the time the lamps were being lit in the front rooms. The second complained shortly after. Ida, who had been quiet for some minutes, rose suddenly from her chair and went inside and did not come back out. Mary followed her a few minutes later, and the neighbourhood girls, halfway down the block by then, had already begun to feel the first of what they would later, in their own homes, describe as a terrible wrongness in the belly. Inside the house, the cook was sent for water and then for ice. The upstairs maid was sent for the doctor. The children were carried upstairs to the nursery and laid on top of the sheets, because the heat of the day still lived in the rooms, and because the mothers of that century knew that a sick child should be laid flat and kept still. The lamps were turned low. Pennington stood at the foot of the stairs with the newspaper still in his hand, not reading it, not yet understanding what he was looking at, and only aware that the house had tilted in some way he could not name, and that the silence in the upstairs hall was not the silence of sleep. Somewhere down the street, in the quiet dark between the gas lamps, the box of chocolates still sat on the veranda table where Mary had left it. The pink ribbon lay beside it in a loose curl. The note, "With love to yourself and baby, Mrs. C," lay folded on the hall table where she had set it down. The writer of the note was 3,000 miles away, in a boarding house room in San Francisco, and had by now unpacked her trunk in a small hotel in the town of St. Helena, and had eaten her own supper, and had gone to bed early, and was sleeping with the calm of a woman who had done a thing and would not need to do it again. As the first summons for Doctor Heisel went out into the Dover night at a little past 9, by the time he had crossed the yard and climbed the front steps and set his bag down on the hall table beside the folded brown paper, Mary Dunning was on her hands and knees in the upstairs hall, and her sister was in the bedroom beyond, and the children were crying in the room beyond that. And the summer heat that had held the town for 7 days had not lifted and would not lift for another night. The lamp in the sitting room burned low and even, the way lamps do in houses that have just begun to understand that something has happened to them. Chapter 2. The Veranda. The porch boards at 210 South State Street were old pine, laid down in an earlier decade and painted many times since, and they held the heat of the day long after the sun had gone behind the elms. On the afternoon of August 9th, 1898, they were still warm through the soles of the children's bare feet at 5 o'clock, and still warm at 6, and still warm at 7, when Mary Elizabeth Dunning carried the white box out through the screen door and set it down on the small wicker table beside the lemonade. The house behind her had passed through its ordinary afternoon the way such houses did. The cook had finished the washing up from the midday meal and had gone out to the kitchen garden to cut a few herbs for the supper. The upstairs maid had aired the bedrooms and had come down to iron a pair of collars for Pennington's morning. The dining room had been swept. The brass of the front door knocker had been polished that morning, and the thin smell of the polish still clung faintly to the hall. The day had done what days did, and now it was winding itself down into the blue hour, and the porch was where the family gathered in that hour, because the porch was where the air, if it moved at all, could be felt. Mary set the box down carefully. She untied the pink ribbon a second time in front of her sister, because Ida had not yet seen it, and the ribbon was a pretty thing and worth admiring twice. The gold script on the lid caught the last of the light. Ida bent over it with the frank pleasure of a woman who had raised children on small economies and who did not receive white boxes of chocolates from San Francisco department stores in the ordinary course of her week. She said something about the ribbon, she said something about the handkerchief, and she turned the note over in her fingers and read the 6 words aloud in a quiet voice, and she and Mary looked at each other, and Mary said the name Corby in the way a person says a name she is trying to place, and then let it go, because the chocolate was there in front of them, and the heat was there around them, and the lemonade was there on the table, and the small mysteries of an afternoon were not, in that moment, worth solving. The children came first, because children always come first where chocolate is concerned. The eldest took a chocolate drop covered in sprinkles, and the younger took an oblong bonbon that was almost too large for his mouth. They ran off with them toward the far end of the porch, and Ida called after them to slow down and not to eat so fast, and they did not listen. This because children on a porch in August do not listen to anything except the sound of their own small delight. Ida took several pieces. She was a woman who had not been given much in the way of small pleasures in her 44 years, and she took the candy the way such women do, carefully, making each piece last. Mary took 3. She ate the first slowly, standing at the rail with her hand resting on the warm wood, looking out at the street where the last of the buggies were going home. She ate the second sitting down in the rocking chair nearest the table. She ate the third more absently, while listening to Ida tell a long soft story about a neighbour in Ida's own town who had done something mildly ridiculous at a church supper. Miss Millington and Miss Bateman came up the walk at a little past 6. They had been out walking, as girls did in that last light. They had stopped by because they often stopped by, and because Miss Millington was fond of Mary and had grown up calling at the Pennington house. They were offered lemonade and chocolate both. They accepted 1 piece each because they had suppers waiting for them at home, and they stood on the porch only long enough to be polite, and then went on down the street in the soft dusk with the taste of the chocolate still on their tongues. By the time they had reached their own front doors, Mary was feeling the first of it. It began, as arsenic poisoning always begins, with a burning in the throat, a thin metallic warmth at the back of the tongue, and a dryness that lemonade did not relieve, and a thirst that grew as she drank. She set down her glass. She said nothing, because the feeling was not yet a thing one spoke about. Ida, beside her, had gone quiet also, and was looking at her hands in her lap with a small fixed expression, as though she had remembered something unpleasant and was trying to set it aside. The children came back along the porch. The eldest was holding her stomach. The youngest was whimpering, not loudly, the way a tired child whimpers at the end of a long day, and Ida rose from her chair to take him onto her knee. He did not want to be held. He arched his back against her, and she set him down again, and he sat on the boards of the porch with his head against her shoes, and he began to cry in earnest. Mary said she thought she would go in for a moment. She said it in the light voice a woman uses when she does not wish to alarm her sister, and she went through the screen door and let it fall shut behind her with the soft wooden clap that it always made, and she went down the hall to the small washroom beneath the stairs, and she was sick there for some minutes. When she came out, the hall had darkened, because the cook had not yet lit the lamps in the back of the house. She stood for a moment with her hand against the wall. She called for the maid. The maid came at once and saw Mary's face and put an arm under her elbow, and walked her to the sitting-room sofa and laid her down on it without asking. Then the maid went out through the front door and down the steps and across the yard toward Dr. Heisel's house 3 streets away, not running, because a maid did not run on a public street, but walking quickly, as the way a woman walks who has understood that the evening has gone wrong. On the porch, Ida had begun to vomit into the flower bed at the edge of the steps. The children had been taken inside by the cook, who had come out at the sound of them crying, and had been laid down on the rug in the front parlour because the cook had not wanted to carry them up the stairs. Pennington, in his study at the back of the house, had heard none of it yet, because his windows were closed against the heat, and he had been reading a legal brief with his spectacles low on his nose and the gaslight beside him turned high. It was not until the cook came to his door and knocked, and said, "Mr. Pennington, sir," in a voice that he did not recognise at once as hers, that he put down the brief and rose. By the time he reached the front hall, Mary was making a sound on the sofa that he had never before heard a human being make. It was not a cry, it was not a moan. It was something lower and more private than either, a kind of continuous, quiet labour of the body against itself. He knelt beside her. He took her hand. Her hand was cold, her forehead was cold, her lips were going a colour he did not wish to see. Doctor Heisel came through the front door at a little past 9, carrying his black leather bag and his coat folded over his arm, because he had not stopped to put the coat on. He went to Mary first. He examined her for perhaps 2 minutes, and then he straightened, and he looked at Pennington, and Pennington read in the doctor's face what Pennington had already begun to know. "What did she eat?" the doctor asked, and Pennington, who did not yet know, turned to the maid, and the maid led them out to the porch, where the white box still sat on the wicker table in the dark, and the pink ribbon lay beside it, and the note in its careful feminine hand lay folded beneath the ribbon, where Ida had set it down. Dr. Heisel picked up one of the chocolates. He held it close to the porch lamp the cook had lit. He broke it open with his thumbnail, and he looked at what was inside it, and he did not say anything for a long moment. He set it back in the box. He said, in the quiet, clipped voice of a country doctor who has understood his situation, that no one in the house was to eat anything further from that box, and that the box itself was to be placed on the hall table and covered with a cloth and not touched again by any hand. The two women, he said, were very ill. He did not yet say how ill. Down the street, in the small frame house of the Millington family, Miss Millington had sat down suddenly at the supper table and had gone very pale, and her mother had risen at once and had asked her what was wrong, and Miss Millington had said only that her stomach felt on fire, and then she had been sick onto the floor of the dining room, and her father had gone out the back door and across the yards in the dark toward the Pennington house, because he had seen his daughter coming away from that house an hour before, and he wanted to know what she had been given to eat there. He met Dr. Heisel on the Pennington porch. They spoke in low voices for perhaps a minute. Then Mr. Millington turned and went home at a run, and Dr. Heisel sent the maid for a second doctor, because one doctor was not going to be enough for the night that was coming. Yet upstairs in the nursery, the two children had been undressed and laid on top of the sheets in their small cotton shifts. The elder girl was vomiting into a basin the cook held for her. The younger boy had gone quiet in a way that his mother, who was herself by then too ill to rise, did not yet know about. The maid had opened the window to let in whatever air the night could offer, and no air came in, and the lamp on the bureau burned steadily, and the wallpaper of small blue flowers that Mary had chosen for the nursery 3 summers ago looked down on the children with the same mild pattern it had always shown. Ida was carried from the porch to the small back bedroom on the ground floor, because the stairs would not have her. She was laid on the bed in her summer dress, and the maid cut the dress down the back with a pair of kitchen shears, because the laces at the front could not be undone in time. She was covered with a light sheet, and a basin was placed beside her on the floor, and the maid sat on the edge of the bed with one hand on Ida's shoulder and the other hand holding the basin, and did not leave that position for many hours. Hurry was carried upstairs by Pennington and the second doctor, who had arrived by then. They took her slowly. She did not weigh very much. They laid her in her own bed, in the room she had slept in as a girl, and had returned to as a grown woman, and the familiar counterpane was turned back, and the lamp at her bedside was turned up, and Dr. Heisel sat down in the chair beside her bed, and did not, for the rest of that long night, leave it. And the house at 210 South State Street had, by 10:30, become a sick house. The lamps in the front rooms were turned low because the light hurt the women's eyes. The lamps in the back rooms were turned high because the doctors needed to see. The cook kept the kettle going on the kitchen range, because whatever was asked for in the sick rooms was most likely to be boiled water. The maid went up the stairs and down the stairs and up the stairs again, carrying cloths, carrying basins, carrying the small domestic things that a sick house in 1898 ran on. The porch stood empty behind its screen door. The white box on the hall table lay under a folded napkin the cook had put over it, as though covering it might keep whatever was in it from spreading any further into the rooms of the house. Outside, on South State Street, the cicadas kept up their long dry note in the elms. A horse clopped past once, slowly, its driver unaware of anything. The moon had risen above the courthouse, and its light lay thin and white on the boards of the empty veranda, where only a few hours earlier a woman had been laughing quietly at her sister's story, and a box of chocolates had been opened in the last of the day, and the ribbon of pink satin had been laid across the wicker table in a loose pretty curl that the moon now showed, unmoving, where it had been left. Chapter 3. Doctor Heisel's Long Night. The medicine of 1898 was not without its remedies, but its remedies for arsenic were small weapons against a very old enemy. Dr. Heisel knew what he had in his bag, and he knew what his bag could do, and he knew within the first hour what it could not. He had, in his black leather case, a glass vial of freshly prepared ferric hydroxide, because a country doctor in Delaware kept such a thing against the possibility of poisoning, and he administered it to Mary Dunning at once, mixed into water, and then again an hour later. He had mustard, which he used as an emetic on the children, because their stomachs were still young enough that what had not yet been absorbed might yet be brought up. He had a solution of magnesium sulfate. He had laudanum for the pain, which he gave sparingly, because the pain of arsenic was not the kind that laudanum could wholly quiet. He had the small familiar implements of his profession, his stethoscope, his thermometer, his notebook, and his fountain pen, and he used them steadily through the night, because a doctor without a cure uses what he has left, well, which is attention. The house moved around him in the measured way that sick houses move. The maid, whose name was Anna, did not sleep. She carried the basins down to the kitchen and emptied them into the slop bucket, and rinsed them in the scullery, and carried them back up the stairs. She brought fresh cloth soaked in cool water to lay on Mary's forehead, and she changed them as they warmed, which was often, because Mary's skin was hot in a way that cool cloths could not hold for long. She brought the same to Ida in the small downstairs bedroom, where the second doctor, a younger man by the name of Hall, was keeping the watch. Anna moved between the two rooms with the patient, unhurried competence of a woman who understood that her movements were the only orderly thing left in the house that night. The cook, whose name was Sarah, had kept the range going. She boiled water continuously because boiled water was wanted for everything, for the cloths, for the weak tea that Mary could not keep down but was offered every half hour regardless, for the washing of hands, for the small domestic rituals by which an American household in 1898 held fear at a distance. She did not eat that night. She did not sit. At about 2 a.m, she went out the back door into the kitchen garden and stood for a few minutes in the dark among the tomato vines and the herbs, breathing the cooler air, and then she came back inside and put the kettle on again. Pennington sat in a chair in the upstairs hall between the two bedrooms. He had put down the legal brief he had been reading in his study. He had not picked up anything else. He sat with his hands folded on his knees, in his morning coat because he had not thought to change it. He was a man who in his congressional years had sat through long nights in Washington, through committee hearings that ran past dawn, through floor debates that spilled into the small hours, and he had been known for his stillness in such settings, his capacity to sit without restlessness for as long as a thing required. He used that stillness now. He did not pace, he did not speak much. When the doctors needed him, he rose. When they did not, he sat. Ida was the first to go. She died. At a little after 4 a.m. on August 11th, which was not the first night but the second because the arsenic had done its work slowly and thoroughly and had not let her go easily. She had been conscious for most of the night before, and had spoken a little to Dr. Hall, and had asked after her children twice and had been told each time that they were resting, which was in one sense true and in another sense not, because the elder girl was sleeping fitfully in the nursery upstairs under the care of a hired nurse who had come in from a neighbouring house, and the younger boy had been very bad for some hours, but had turned around midnight and was now drinking a little water from a spoon and would, as the mercy of his smallness allowed, survive. Ida was not told of his recovery, because by the time it was certain she was beyond the reach of news. She'd gone quiet in her last hour. Dr. Hall had held her wrist and had felt the pulse go thin and thinner, and then had felt it go. He had leaned down and listened for breath and heard none. He had taken his watch from his pocket and had noted the time on a small card he kept for such purposes, and then he had sat for a moment with his hand still on her wrist, because the etiquette of his generation did not allow a doctor to rise immediately from a death. When he did rise, he went out into the hall and he did not need to say anything, because Pennington saw his face in the low lamplight and understood. Pennington went in to his daughter and sat with her for perhaps 10 minutes. He did not weep. He arranged the sheet. He put her hand beneath it. He smoothed her hair back from her forehead, with a gesture that the maid, watching from the doorway, would remember for the rest of her life, because it was the gesture of a man who had done that same thing for the same daughter when she was 3 years old and feverish in a crib, and who had not expected to do it again at the age she had reached. Then he went out into the hall and climbed the stairs to his other daughter's room. Mary lived through that day and into the next. She was weaker in the morning and weaker at noon, and by evening she was not speaking. Doctor Heisel did not leave the chair beside her bed for more than a few minutes at a time. He ate what Anna brought him on a tray. He wrote short notes in his pocket notebook. He took Mary's pulse every half hour with a steadiness that was itself a kind of prayer, because a country doctor praying for his patient in 1898 often prayed with his fingers on her wrist and his eyes on his watch and called it medicine. Mary died in the late morning of August 12th. The room was full of the high, clean summer light that came in through the east window, and the curtains had been tied back because she had said earlier that she wished to see the elm. The elm outside her window was still in leaf, and the leaves were hanging in the windless air as they had hung for the entire week, and the light through them lay in shifting patches on the foot of her bed. She was conscious for a little while at the end. She spoke her father's name once. She did not speak her husband's. Dr. Heisel afterward, when he had gone downstairs and washed his hands in the kitchen basin and sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that Sarah had put in front of him without being asked, told Pennington that his daughter had died without fear, which was a thing he said of many patients, whether or not it was wholly true, because it was what the living needed to hear, and because he believed, in Mary's case, that it was. The undertaker came in the early afternoon. His name was Charles Richardson, and he was known in Dover because there was only one undertaker in a town of that size, and he had attended to the Pennington family before, in the deaths of Pennington's wife and of an elder child who had died young. He came in his black coat and his soft black hat, and he went first to Ida in the downstairs room because Ida had been waiting the longer, and then he went up to Mary. His assistant was a young man of perhaps 19, who had not yet learned to keep his face still in such houses, and who stood in the hall with his hat in his hands and looked at the wallpaper because he could not look at the doors. The bodies were taken out of the house late in the afternoon, through the front door and down the front steps. Because in Dover, the front door was the proper door for the dead, and the side door and the kitchen door were for the living. They went into the undertaker's wagon one at a time, with a pause between, and the neighbours on South State Street stood at their front gates in small silent groups and watched them go, and no one spoke, because there was nothing yet to say that was not a question, and the questions were not ones that a neighbour asked on the day of a funeral. The house, when the wagon had gone, settled into the particular stillness of a house from which the dying has ended, and the grieving has not yet begun. The lamps were put out in the sick rooms, the curtains were drawn, the white box on the hall table, still under its folded napkin, was carried by Doctor Heisel into the study and locked in Pennington's desk drawer. Because Doctor Heisel had already sent a telegram that morning to Dr. T.R. Wolfe at Delaware College, and he had already explained, in the careful language of a country doctor writing to a state chemist, that he was in possession of a quantity of candy he believed to contain arsenic, and he had already understood that the box, and every piece inside it, was now evidence. Pennington sat that evening in his study alone. The lamp was low, the window was open to the garden, the cicadas were quieter than they had been. He sat for a long time without moving, and then he rose, and he went to the tall cabinet against the far wall, and he unlocked it with the small key he carried on his watch chain, and he took out a folder he had kept there for more than a year. The folder held letters postmarked San Francisco, and letters addressed to his daughter Mary and forwarded to Dover, and read by Mary and given to him by Mary at various times over the past year because she had not known what else to do with them. They were anonymous. They were detailed. They described in a firm and satisfied feminine hand the daily life of her husband in San Francisco, the places he went, the woman he was seen with, the small intimacies of their arrangement. They were the kind of letters that a person writes not to inform but to wound, and their cumulative effect upon Mary had been, over a year, to strip her of the small hope she had kept for her marriage, and to leave her with a grief she could not share. Pennington carried the folder to his desk. He set it down under the lamp. He opened it. He took out one of the letters, any letter, at random. So then he unlocked the drawer in which Dr. Heisel had placed the box of chocolates. He lifted out the small slip of paper that had lain inside the bowl. He set the note beside the letter. He adjusted his spectacles. He bent over the desk in the small circle of lamplight, and he looked. The same hand had written both. He sat for a long time with his palm flat on the desk beside the two pieces of paper. The clock in the hall struck 10. The cat, which had at last emerged from wherever it had spent the previous 2 nights, came in through the open study door and sat on the rug and watched him. Pennington did not notice. He was looking at the 6 words at the bottom of the note, "With love to yourself and baby, Mrs. C." He was looking at the closing of one of the anonymous letters, which was written in the same hand, though signed with a different small cruelty. He was understanding in the slow methodical way that men of his profession understood things, that the person who had tormented his daughter through the mail for a year had at last tired of words. He did not weep. He closed the folder. He closed the drawer. He put out the lamp. He went out of the study and climbed the stairs in the dark, and he did not go to his own bedroom but to Mary's, where the bed had been stripped by the maid and remade with fresh linen, and where the window was still open because no one had thought to close it, and where the elm outside still hung in its windless leaf. He sat down in the chair Dr. Heisel had sat in through the night. He did not turn on a lamp. He sat there until the sky began to lighten, and then he went down to breakfast. Because he was a man who had been raised to go down to breakfast no matter what the night had held, and by the time he sat down at the dining room table the household understood, from the set of his shoulders, that he had decided something in the dark hours, and that what he had decided would carry. Chapter 4. The Folder in the Desk. The letters had begun arriving in the late summer of 1897. They came by ordinary mail, and they were addressed to Mrs. John P. Dunning at the Pennington house, and they were postmarked San Francisco. They came at intervals of perhaps 2 weeks, sometimes 3, never in any pattern Mary could predict, which was, she would come to understand, part of their purpose, because a letter one expects can be braced for, and a letter one does not expect arrives at the throat before the mind can set itself. Mary had opened this first one in her father's hall, standing near the same small table on which the white box would, a year later, be laid. She had opened it without suspicion, because she opened all her mail without suspicion, and because she had been in that first week still writing her husband daily, and was in the habit of receiving mail from the West. She had read the first pages standing, and the second page sitting, in the straight chair beside the hall table, and the third page not at all, because the third page had slid from her hand onto the floor and she had not retrieved it until several minutes later, after she had understood what she was reading. The letter was not signed. It was written in a firm feminine hand. It described her husband's life in San Francisco in a tone that was neither sympathetic nor properly cruel, but rather detailed, the way a shopkeeper's inventory is detailed, as though the writer had simply assumed that Mary would wish to know, as any reasonable wife would wish to know, where her husband took his breakfast, and with whom, and what he wore, and what was said at the table, and where he went afterward, and who walked with him, and how that person dressed, and how often he was observed in her company at the racetrack, and at the cafes on Market Street, and at the fashionable establishments along Kearney. There had been, on that first page, a phrase that Mary would carry with her for the rest of her short life. The writer had described her husband's companion as an interesting and pretty woman he was constantly seen with. The phrase had a particular kind of cruelty in it, because it was not vulgar, and it was not accusing, and it was the kind of phrase a woman of some breeding might write about another woman in a social note, and its restraint was what made it unbearable. Mary had read it, and had read it again, and had understood in that first minute in her father's hall that the woman who had written the phrase was the woman being described in it. She had not shown the letter to her father for some days. She had put it in the small lacquered box she kept on her dressing table, the box in which she kept her hairpins and a few old pressed flowers and a ribbon her daughter had given her. She had gone on with her week. She had sat at her writing desk in the afternoon and had written her daily letter to San Francisco as though nothing had arrived. She had asked after his health. She had mentioned the garden. She had told him a small story about their daughter. And she had closed with her customary "your affectionate wife." She had sealed the envelope. She had addressed it. She had taken it down to the hall table to be posted. And she had done all of this, she would later say to her sister Ida, because she did not know what else to do, and because she had not yet decided whether the letter was worth believing. The second letter had arrived 3 weeks later. It had been longer and more specific, and had contained a detail about her husband's mornings that Mary knew, from a letter he had sent her several months before, to be true. The writer of the anonymous letter knew a thing about John Preston Dunning that only a woman who saw him in the mornings could know. Mary had sat with the second letter for longer than the first, and she had taken it out of the lacquered box the next day and read it again, and she had, on the third day, gone to her father in his study. Pennington had read the two letters without speaking. He had folded them back into their envelopes. He had said, in his quiet lawyer's voice, that his daughter was to bring any further letters of this kind to him at once, and that she was not to destroy them. He had taken a folder from his cabinet. He had put the two letters into it. He had locked the cabinet. He had not said what he intended to do with the folder, because he had not yet known. He had only known that letters of that kind, written in that hand over a long enough period, might one day be required to prove a thing, and he was a man who had been trained to keep what might one day be required. The folder had grown through the autumn and the winter and the spring. 8 letters, 11. And by the early summer of 1898 there had been more than a dozen. Mary had stopped reading them by then. She had continued to bring them to her father unopened, and he had opened them, and he had read them so that she would not have to, and he had put them into the folder in the order of their arrival, and had locked the cabinet each time. He had not shown them to Ida. He had not shown them to any friend. He had carried the knowledge of them privately, in the way men of his generation carried such knowledge, because to speak of them would have been to acknowledge that his daughter's marriage was a public matter, and in Dover in 1898 the marriage of a Pennington was not a public matter even when the whole town knew. Mary had not written back. There had been no return address to write to, and in any case she would not have written. But she had, over that year, gradually stopped writing her daily letter to San Francisco. She'd gone to writing every second day, then twice a week, then once a week. By the spring of 1898 she was writing only on Sundays, a short, careful letter that said very little, and by the early summer she had stopped writing altogether. The anonymous letters had done their work. They had been designed, Pennington understood, not merely to inform Mary of her husband's infidelity, but to separate her from the habit of him, to break the small daily tether of correspondence that had kept her attached to the idea of his eventual return. Whoever had written them had understood the mechanics of a marriage held together by habit, and had set out methodically to dissolve the habit. That the writer had then, in August, escalated from letters to poison was, Pennington would reflect in the small hours of the morning after Mary's death, not a surprise so much as a conclusion. The letters had been a first campaign, the chocolates were a second. The woman who had written the letters was a woman who finished things. On the morning of August 13th, the day after Mary's death and the day before her funeral, Pennington rose at his usual hour and went down to breakfast, and ate what was put in front of him, which was very little, and then he went into his study and unlocked the cabinet. He took the folder out. He carried it to his desk. He unlocked the desk drawer. He took out the note from the candy box. He arranged the letters in chronological order on the desk, and he laid the note at the end of the sequence in its proper place because the note was simply the last letter in the series. The shortest one, the one in which words had been at last replaced by the thing the words had always been working toward. He sat with the papers for perhaps an hour. Then he rose, and he went into the hall, and he told Anna to send the boy down to the telegraph office with a message he had written on a small card. The message was addressed to the Chief of Police of San Francisco. It stated, in the concise phrasing of a man who had written many such messages in his congressional years, that the sender believed his daughter had been murdered by poisoned candy sent through the United States Post from San Francisco, that he was in possession of evidence that the sender of the candy had also been the sender of a series of anonymous letters over the preceding year, and that he was prepared to travel west at once if the San Francisco authorities required his assistance. The boy took the card and went. Pennington returned to his study. He did not unlock the cabinet again that day. He sat at his desk and read the morning paper from end to end, because the morning paper was what a man of his habits read at that hour. And then he went out to the garden at 10 o'clock and walked once around it, as he always did at 10 o'clock, and then he came back inside, and the house went on around him in its stunned, quiet way, and the maid polished the brass on the front door, because the brass had not been polished that morning, and the maid had been trained to polish it, and the cook made the midday meal, because a meal had to be made, and the clocks in the house kept their time, because clocks keep their time, whether or not there is anyone left in the house who cares what hour it is. The funeral was held on the afternoon of August 14th at Christ Church, which stood at the corner of State and Water Streets, 3 blocks from the Pennington house. The rector, a man named Doctor Harris, had known Mary since her confirmation, and he did not, in his homily, refer directly to the manner of her death, because the manner of her death had not yet been proved, and because he was a man of careful clerical discretion. He spoke of her sweetness. He spoke of her patience. He spoke of the fact that she had returned, in her last years, to the house of her father and had been there, he said, a comfort and a presence, and a quiet gladness. He did not mention her husband. He did not mention San Francisco. He read the old words of the burial service in the slow, even voice of a man who had read them many times in that church for many families, and he committed her, in the phrase the service used, to the mercy of God and the care of the earth. Ida was buried beside her sister in the same plot on the same afternoon. The 2 graves, new and raw, had been dug by the sexton that morning, and the earth beside them was piled in 2 small dark mounds, and the families of the congregation stood around in their summer blacks in the heavy still heat, and the sexton waited a respectful distance off with his shovels. The children, Ida's 2, were there. The elder girl stood beside her grandmother on her father's side, who had come up from Baltimore. The younger boy, still frail from his own ordeal, was held by a nurse, while Ida's husband stood alone and did not weep, because he was a man of the town's small public restraint, and he wept later in his own house, which was the custom. Pennington stood at the head of the graves because he was the father of one daughter and the father-in-law of the other, and because in that town in that century the head of the family stood at the head. He did not speak, he did not need to. He had already spoken in his way, through the telegram that had gone out the previous day, and the reply from the San Francisco police had already arrived by view time the funeral ended, and by the time the Pennington family returned to 210 South State Street in the low afternoon light, the wheels of an investigation 3,000 miles to the west had begun to turn. In his study that evening, Pennington lit the lamp, and he took out the folder again. He added to it the telegram he had received from San Francisco in reply, and he added to it a copy he had made in his own careful legal hand of the message he had sent. He put the folder back in the cabinet. He locked the cabinet. He sat at his desk for a little while with his spectacles in his hand. He did not pick up a book. He did not pick up the newspaper. He sat, and the house was quiet and the cicadas had gone, because the weather had at last begun to turn, and somewhere above the elms the first cooler air of the coming September was moving in slowly over Delaware from the north. He blew out the lamp. He went up the stairs to bed. Chapter 5. Cordelia. The town of Brownsville, Nebraska, in the year of Cordelia's birth, was a river town on the Missouri, set down in the low bluffs on the western bank, and it had been founded not long before by men who gave it their own name. Her family was one of those founding families, and the town bore it the way such towns bore the names of the men who had cleared the first streets and built the first warehouses and set down the first plank sidewalks along the banks of the river. Cordelia Brown was born in 1854 in a frame house that stood a short walk from the steamboat landing, and her earliest memories were the memories of a river child. The low whistle of the boats coming upstream in the morning, the shouts of the stevedores on the landing, the smell of wet rope and river mud and wood smoke, the sound of the plank sounding hollow beneath a running child's feet. The house she was raised in had the close warm smell of wood stove heat in winter and of boiled laundry in summer. And the small oil lamps that lit its rooms at night burned kerosene, because that was what a river town in Nebraska burned in those years. The rooms were papered in the sober florals of the period. The parlour had an upright piano on which Cordelia was taught to play a little, though she did not take to it. The kitchen had an iron range that her mother kept polished to a soft black shine. The bedrooms upstairs had washstands with china basins and pitchers, and the water in the pitchers froze on winter nights, and the first task of the morning for the maid or for the older children was to break the thin skin of ice on the surface before the household could wash. There were lessons. There was church on Sundays, in a small Protestant chapel on the edge of town whose bell was rung by a rope that ran down through the floor of the belfry into the vestibule, and whose pews were of pine-painted white, and whose windows looked out on the river. There were the long flat summers that the western prairie laid down upon its children, the heat of July in a frame house without shade, the sound of the cottonwoods along the riverbank, the slow processions of the paddle-wheel boats coming down from the north with their loads of lumber and their loads of hides. There were the winters, which were the part of Nebraska that travellers remembered, when the wind came down off the northern plains and pressed the frame houses hard, and the stove was never allowed to go out, and a child who came in from the cold stood in front of it with her hands held close to the iron and her breath still visible in the kitchen air. This was the soil she began in, and she grew out of it the way some plants grow out of plain soil, which is to say pale and long and fixed upon some sun she had set her mind upon reaching. Her family was comfortable, her prospects were ordinary, her temperament from the beginning was not. She married Welcome Botkin in Kansas City in September of 1872 when she was 18. The name Welcome was old and unusual and had come down his family from an earlier century. He was a man of modest trade and steady disposition, and the marriage was the marriage of a young woman who had been raised to consider marriage the natural next room of her life, and who had walked through the door without looking too long at what lay on the other side. Their son Beverly was born not long after. Beverly was raised in Stockton, California, in the care of his father, because by the time the boy was of school age, his parents had, in the quiet way of 19th century separations, come to an understanding that they were better apart than together. It was not a divorce. Divorce in the 1880s and 1890s was a public matter, and it required a cause to be named in a courtroom, and it attached itself to a woman's name in the way a brand attaches itself to leather. A separation by mutual arrangement with no courtroom and no papers was a different thing. Cordelia and Welcome entered into such an arrangement, and it suited them, and neither of them remarried, and neither of them objected. And the boy Beverly grew up in Stockton in his father's house, and Cordelia, in the meantime, took herself to San Francisco. San Francisco in the late 1880s and the early 1890s was the richest and the strangest city on the western coast of the continent. It had been built quickly on gold and silver and the shipping trade, and its wealth had arrived without much accompanying patience. Its hills were crowded with houses that had gone up in a hurry. Its streets climbed and fell at angles the eastern cities had never known. Its cable cars clanged up Powell and down California. Its harbour was full of the masts of ships from every port on the Pacific Rim, and its wharves smelled of cod and tar and the damp that came in with the fog. Its Chinatown pressed up against its financial district. Its Barbary coast kept its own hours, and its Nob Hill rose above everything in a row of stone mansions built by the men who had owned the railroads. It was a city in which a woman with a little money and a taste for being noticed could arrange herself as she pleased, and Cordelia arranged herself. She took rooms in boarding houses of reasonable respectability. She moved from one to another over the years as moods and rents required. She had, by the mid-1890s, settled at a boarding house on Geary Street, which was a good address without being an elegant one, the kind of place a woman of uncertain means and certain tastes could stay without attracting the wrong sort of attention. She paid her bills, she kept her rooms clean, or rather, she kept the maid of the house at work in them. She dressed well, she dressed better than her means strictly allowed, but which was a kind of accomplishment in its way, because the San Francisco of that decade offered many opportunities for a woman to overspend upon her appearance, and very few for her to recover from having done so. Her days had the shape of the days of a certain kind of San Francisco woman of the period. She rose late, she breakfasted in her room, because that was the custom of the boarding house. She went out in the late morning down Geary toward Market, and she walked the long blocks of Market Street at her own pace, looking in the windows of the City of Paris and the White House and the Emporium, which were the great department stores of the city in those years. She took her midday meal in one of the cafes that had sprung up along Kearny and Montgomery, and she was known at several of them by name, which was something she cultivated, because to be known by name at a cafe was a small public mark of one's standing. She went in the afternoons to the racetrack at Ingleside, or to the park, or to the bay, or sometimes only to sit in the lobby of the Palace Hotel and watch the arrivals, because the Palace Hotel was the largest building of its kind west of Chicago, and its lobby was, for a certain class of spectator, a kind of theatre. She loved to be looked at. It was not a secret vanity. It was her public manner. She dressed for being looked at. She posed for being looked at. The photographs taken of her over the years of her life in San Francisco were many, and they were not the casual portraits that an ordinary woman sat for once or twice in her life to mark a wedding or a birth. They were studied compositions, three-quarter views, of full lengths against painted backdrops, hand to chin, gaze averted, hand on hip, gaze direct. Her hair arranged in one fashion this season and another fashion next. She had, by her own acknowledgement, posed for more than 100 such portraits, and she kept copies of them, and showed them, and gave them to friends, and was pleased when a friend asked for another. When the newspapers at last turned their attention to her in 1898 and 1899, they would print these photographs with an almost malicious pleasure, because the photographs were the most eloquent self-accusation she had ever offered the world, and a newspaper did not have to write a word of commentary for them to do their work. The newspapers would also, in their time, describe her as a woman of excessive fondness for posing, and as a woman who possessed the vanities of her sex in an exaggerated degree. These were the phrases of the 1890s press, and they were the phrases with which the 1890s press attacked women whose appetites had become public. They were not wholly inaccurate. They were also not wholly fair, because the appetite for being looked at is a human appetite, and it is not peculiar to women, and it is not by itself a criminal quality. What made Cordelia Botkin eventually different from any number of other women who liked to be looked at was not the appetite. It was what she was prepared to do when she became certain that the one person she most wished to be looked at by was about to stop looking. Her finances in those years were irregular. Welcome sent her money. Her family in Nebraska sent her money. She had small incomes from arrangements that the biographers who came after her were never quite able to trace, and there were suggestions in the San Francisco papers that some of her friendships with older gentlemen of means had been friendships of a particular caste, though no such friendship was ever named in the record, and she did not, in the end, have to account for her income in any court. She lived, as many women of the San Francisco boarding houses lived, on a combination of remittance and luck and the quiet economic charity of people who liked her company. She did not keep close friends, she kept acquaintances, she was known to the clerks at the City of Paris, and to the waiters at several of the Market Street cafes, and to the bookmakers at Ingleside, and to the matron of her boarding house, and to a small circle of San Francisco women of her own type, with whom she exchanged calls and gossip and small favours, and among whom she was regarded as clever and amusing and not entirely trustworthy. A woman named Mrs. Corby was among these acquaintances, and lived in the same boarding house on Geary Street, and was fond of Cordelia in the easy way of boarding house fondnesses, and would figure later in the story without having intended to, because her surname began with the letter C, and because her name was known to John Preston Dunning and to his wife, and because Cordelia had a long memory for the names that circulated in the small world she moved in. She had, by the time of her meeting with Dunning in 1895, lived in San Francisco for the better part of 10 years. She was 41. She had never worked in any regular sense. Yet she had never kept her house in the manner of her mother. She had never raised her son, who was a young man by then and whom she saw rarely. She had, instead, lived the life she had made for herself, which was a life of walks down Market Street and afternoons at the racetrack and late suppers in cafes and long sessions before photographers' lenses and slow, idle evenings in the parlour of the boarding house. It was not a life that would have been thought enviable by the women of Brownsville, Nebraska. It was the life she had wanted, and she had got it, and she was, in so far as such a woman could be, content with it. And yet, Beneath the life, there was a certain kind of waiting. She was a woman who had arranged herself for being seen. She was a woman who had built her days around being noticed. She was a woman who had understood, from her girlhood in the frame house in Brownsville, that a life was not a life unless someone was observing it, and for all the many clerks and waiters and bookmakers and photographers who had observed her, she had not yet been observed by the particular person whose observation would, in her mind, complete her. She did not know who that person would be, because she had not yet met him, but she was ready for him when he came, which is perhaps another way of saying that she had arranged her life in such a way that when he came she would take hold of him, and she would not let him go. He came in Golden Gate Park on an afternoon in 1895 with a bicycle that had broken down. But that is the next chapter, and the evening has run on long enough. For now, let the reader hold only the image of the woman in the boarding house on Geary Street, and in the fading afternoon light, standing at her window in one of the gowns she had purchased with money that was not quite hers, with her hair just done, waiting for the hour at which she would put on her hat and go out. The street below would have been in shadow by then. The fog would have been rolling in from the Pacific, as it did on most afternoons in that city, slipping over Twin Peaks in a long, slow wave and settling into the lower streets. The lamplighter would have been coming along Geary with his pole. The boarding-house cat would have been asleep on the hall rug. The gas in her own room would have been lit, and its small flame would have been doubled in the tall pier glass that stood in the corner of her room, so that she would have seen herself there in the glass, and would have paused, as she always paused, to consider the woman she had arranged, and to be satisfied with her, and to turn away from the glass only when the satisfaction was complete. She carried that satisfaction with her out of the boarding house, and down Geary and into the San Francisco evening, and it was the same satisfaction she would carry, 3 years later, down the same street to the candy store of George Hos, and from there to the drugstore, and from there to the ferry post office with a parcel wrapped in brown paper in her hand. Chapter 6. Golden Gate Park, 1895. The day she met him was the kind of day the city kept for its advertisements. The fog had lifted by 10 in the morning. The sky over the park had gone a thin clear blue. The wind off the Pacific came in with its usual damp coolness, and the eucalyptus along the drives gave off their sharp medicinal smell when the sun struck them, and the long carriageways curved through the green of the park in the unhurried way they had been laid out to curve. Golden Gate Park in 1895 was not yet old. It had been laid out only in the previous generation, on a stretch of coastal dunes that an earlier generation of San Franciscans had thought could never be made to grow anything. The dunes had been planted, slowly and stubbornly, with grasses and then with shrubs and then with trees, and by the middle of the 1890s the park had become what its planners had intended, a long green breathing room pulled between the city and the sea. Its paths were gravelled, its drives were raked, its benches were painted a uniform dark green, its conservatory, the pale glass conservatory of flowers at the eastern end, stood among its lawns like something lifted from an English estate. Its lakes held ducks and the small hired rowboats of courting couples. It was, on a clear afternoon, the most self-conscious and the prettiest public space west of the Mississippi. Cordelia had come to the park that afternoon alone. She had come, as she often came, simply to walk, and to be in the moving company of strangers, and to be seen by whatever strangers were there to see her. She was dressed in the manner of her better afternoons, in a walking costume of dark silk with the close-fitted jacket of the mid-1890s and the narrow skirt that fell straight to her boots, and she carried a small parasol, and her hair was pinned in the arrangement her hairdresser had given it that morning at a shop on Sutter Street. She had taken the streetcar out to the park from downtown, and had gotten down at the Stanton Street entrance, and had walked in along the main drive, and had turned, eventually, onto one of the side paths, where the benches were set back among the eucalyptus, and where the traffic was only the foot traffic of the park-goers on their walking rounds. She sat down on one of those benches. She opened her parasol against the afternoon sun, though the sun at that hour was thin. She looked out along the path. A man came along the path, pushing a bicycle that was not behaving. John Preston Dunning, in 1895, was 36 years old. He was a working journalist for the Associated Press, posted at the San Francisco Bureau, which was a good posting for an ambitious newspaperman in that decade, because San Francisco was the western hub for wire traffic to and from the Pacific, and a correspondent at the San Francisco Bureau filed stories that ran in newspapers from Boston to New Orleans. He had, behind him, a marriage of some years' standing to Mary Elizabeth Pennington of Dover, Delaware, and a small daughter born of that marriage, and a wife whom he had left in Delaware in the Pennington house when his work had carried him west. He had in front of him a long afternoon and a bicycle whose rear wheel was rubbing against its frame. He saw the woman on the bench. He slowed. He stopped. He turned the bicycle over and set it on its seat and its handlebars on the grass, in the manner of a man accustomed to making small mechanical adjustments in public. "Mother," and he crouched down beside it and began to examine the rear wheel. He was a good-looking man in the style of his generation, which meant that he was clean-shaven except for a trimmed moustache, and that his hair was parted carefully on one side, and that he wore a sack coat and a soft collar and a narrow tie, and that he carried himself with the slight forward lean of a man who had been trained to walk quickly and to look alert. He was, by the recollections of those who knew him, a man of considerable charm and of not much principle, and the charm had always been easier for him to exercise than the principle. She watched him work on the wheel for perhaps a minute. Then she spoke. She said something light, as a woman on a bench in the park might say something light to a stranger fussing with a mechanical failure, and he looked up. And he looked at her, and he answered, and within another minute he had set the bicycle aside, wheel and all, and was sitting on the bench beside her. The conversation of that first hour would later be the subject of much reconstruction in the San Francisco press. What was eventually established, and what Dunning himself would later acknowledge, was that the two of them had agreed, before they parted that afternoon, to meet again. Whether the bicycle had genuinely broken down, or whether its failure had been quietly engineered by its rider when he had seen the woman on the bench, was a matter on which accounts differed, and on which Dunning, when pressed, gave different answers in different years. It did not, in the end, matter. What mattered was that an hour that might have been only an hour had become, by its own small steady momentum, at the first hour of a 3-year arrangement. He did not tell her that he was married. She did not ask. He gave her his name as John Dunning because that was his name. She gave him her name as Mrs. Curtis because Curtis was not her name at all, and because she had decided, in the first minute of their conversation, that the woman she would be to this man was not the woman she was to the rest of the city. She told him her husband was abroad, in England, she said, and would not be back for some time, and their arrangement was, she implied without saying, an arrangement that allowed her considerable freedom. She was a skillful liar. Her lies were not extravagant. They were the small, practical lies that a woman in her circumstances had learned to tell in order to open doors that would otherwise have remained closed, and she told them without heat and she told them without flourish, and Dunning accepted them as he would have accepted the truth, because the lies were what he wanted to hear. They met again a few days later, then again. Within 2 weeks they were meeting regularly. Within a month, Dunning had taken a room in the same boarding house on Geary Street where Cordelia lived, which was an arrangement of a boldness that surprised even the matron of the house, though the matron said nothing, because boarding house matrons in San Francisco in that decade had long since learned to say nothing. They had their meals at the boarding house table when it suited them. They were seen together at the cafes on Market Street in the evenings. They were seen at the Ingleside racetrack on afternoons when Dunning had a free hour. They went to the theatre. They went to the Cliff House for supper on Sunday afternoons, to look at the seals on Seal Rock through the plate glass of its dining room, to take the long, slow horse-car ride back through the park in the dusk. They made, as lovers sometimes make, a whole small second city within the larger city, built entirely of the places they went together. He called her Ada. It was not her name. It was the name of a former love of his, a woman he had known in the East before his marriage, and he had said to Cordelia, early in their knowing each other, that she resembled Ada in some way. In the turn of her head or the line of her shoulder, he was not sure which, and he had begun to call her by that name as a small private endearment. He had persisted in it. He had continued to call her Ada for 3 years. And he called her Ada when he spoke to her in the boarding house and in the cafes and in the park and in their small late hours together. It was, in its way, one of the great quiet cruelties of his life, because to call a woman by the name of someone else consistently over years is to remind her consistently that she is not being seen, and Cordelia, who had arranged her entire life around the fact of being seen, had taken this substitution and had not complained of it, because she had understood, with a clarity that her vanity did not quite disguise from her, that to object to it would have been to lose him. She told him eventually the truth about herself. She told him that her name was not Curtis. She told him that there was no husband in England. She told him about Welcome in Stockton, about the separation, about her son. She told him with the plain matter-of-factness that she had always been able to summon when plain matter-of-factness served her, that she had lied at the beginning because it had seemed necessary, and that she was not lying now. Dunning, who had his own secrets and had not yet surrendered any of them, accepted the revision with a shrug. He told her nothing in return. He did not tell her about Mary in Delaware. He did not tell her about his daughter. He did not tell her that he wrote to his wife when the spirit moved him, or that his wife wrote to him daily, or that her letters arrived at the boarding house in Geary Street and were sometimes read in rooms where Cordelia could see them being read. She understood at some point in the first year that there was a wife. And it was difficult to live in the same boarding house with a man and not understand that the regular arrival of letters in a certain feminine hand from a certain Eastern address meant what it meant. She did not at first pursue it. She did not ask him. She did not make a scene. She watched and she listened, and she gathered, over the months of their affair, the small specific details of a woman 3,000 miles away whom she had never met and had already begun to hate. She learned in time that this wife's name was Mary. She learned that she lived in Dover, Delaware with her father, and that her father was a former congressman of some standing. She learned that there was a small daughter. She learned from the letters Dunning let her see and from the details he let fall in conversation that Mary was a woman of exceptional sweetness, that she was fond of her garden, that she was fond of candy, and that she wrote to him every day without fail, in a hand he did not always trouble to answer. She learned that there was, among Mary's friends in San Francisco, a woman named Mrs. Corby, whom Mary had known in her own brief residence in the city some years earlier, and with whom Mary still corresponded. She learned, in short, the complete small domestic cartography of the life her lover had left behind, and she kept the map in her mind without ever drawing it on paper. By the late summer of 1897, when the first of the anonymous letters arrived in the hall of the Pennington house in Dover, Cordelia had held the map in her mind for nearly 2 years. She knew where to address a letter, and she knew what details to include in order to make the letter unmistakably informed. She knew the name Mrs. Corby and the letter C, and the small fact that Mary had kept a friendship with a woman of that initial in San Francisco, and she was already thinking in a way that she perhaps had not yet admitted to herself in any plain form, about how one might address a message to Mary in such a way that it would not be suspected, and how one might eventually make that message arrive in a form that words could not accomplish. For the moment, in the summer of 1895 and the autumn that followed, the map lay quiet. She walked on Dunning's arm along Market Street in the evenings. She was called Ada by the one man whose calling her anything mattered. She was, in the small second city they had made, a woman in her element, and she was, in the larger first city in which that second city sat, a woman whose patience was beginning, even then, to take a shape that no one around her had yet recognized. Chapter 7. The platform at Oakland. The winter of 1897 into the spring of 1898 was the winter in which the United States, which had been an ordinary quarrelsome republic the year before, decided it was going to war with Spain. The proximate cause was Cuba and the destruction of the battleship Maine in Havana Harbor in February, and the long agitation of certain newspapers in New York for a war that they had already decided to enjoy. The deeper cause was older and less stated, the slow appetite of a young country that had recently finished its continental expansion and was looking for the next thing. Congress passed its resolutions, the president signed them, the war was declared in April, volunteers were called for, the regular army was enlarged, ships were ordered to the Caribbean, other ships were ordered to the Pacific, where a Spanish squadron lay at Manila in the Philippines, and where an American admiral named Dewey was preparing to do the thing he would, within a month, famously do. In the bureaus of the Associated Press along the eastern coast and in San Francisco, the war meant assignments. Correspondents were being sent out. A dispatch boat was being chartered for the Caribbean. Men who had spent years writing about city politics and stock prices were being offered passage on military transports, and the younger and abler of them were taking the offers. John Preston Dunning was among them. And he had been a reliable hand for the San Francisco Bureau for several years by then, and he was offered a posting to cover the fighting in the Caribbean, specifically the movements of American forces into Puerto Rico, which was to be the secondary theatre of the short war that everyone, even before it began, understood would be short. He accepted the posting without hesitation. The assignment carried a raise, and a chance at the kind of byline that made careers, and an escape from certain difficulties in his San Francisco life that had been accumulating through the winter. Chief among these was that his private arrangements had begun, as such arrangements do, to weigh on him. Cordelia had grown more exacting over the preceding year. She had wanted more of his evenings and more of his assurances, and more of the small daily confirmations that a woman in her position required in order to sustain the fiction that her position was a stable one. She had not, in his hearing, spoken of leaving Welcome. She had not, in his hearing, spoken of his leaving Mary. But the unspoken was in the room between them now, in a way that the unspoken had not been before, and Dunning, who had never been a man comfortable with anything unspoken, had begun to look for an exit. He told her about the Puerto Rico posting in the early days of March. He told her in her room at the boarding house on Geary Street, sitting in the small armchair by her window, with his hat in his hand, in the offhand way he had always preferred to tell her difficult things, as though offhandedness could reduce the weight of what he was saying. He was leaving in a week, that he would be gone for some months, perhaps longer. The war would determine the length. He would file his stories from San Juan and from the interior of the island and from the ships, and the bureau would forward his payments as usual, and she was not to worry about his correspondence, because the posts from the Caribbean were irregular, and she should not read into any silence. She had received this news quietly. She had not made a scene. She had asked him, in the small measured voice she could use when she needed to, whether he meant to return to San Francisco afterward. He had not answered at once. He had turned his hat in his hands. He had looked at the window. He had said at last that when the war was over he meant to go east, and he had said it in the flat tone of a man who'd been rehearsing the sentence in his head for some weeks and who had concluded, upon finally delivering it, that there was no gentler way to arrange the words. He meant to go to Delaware. He meant to return to his wife and his daughter. He meant, he said, to be a father again, and to be a husband again, and to put behind him certain things that he had allowed to go on for too long, and which he now regretted. He had said this last part, the regret, in the even less convincing tone of a man who did not, in fact, regret any of it, and who was only producing the word because he understood that the situation called for it. She had not wept in front of him. She had not raised her voice. She had asked him politely if he would excuse her for a moment, and she had risen, and she had walked out of the room, and she had gone into the small washroom off the upstairs hall of the boarding house, and she had closed the door, and she had stood there for some minutes without making a sound. When she came back out, her face was composed. Her hair was still in its pinned arrangement. Her eyes were dry. She came back into her room and sat down opposite him and said that she understood, and that she wished him well in Puerto Rico, and that she hoped he would write to her when he could, and that she would, for her part, write to him at whatever address he cared to give her. He gave her the address. He rose to leave. At the door he turned, with the small gallantry that had always been his most practiced gesture, and he took her hand and he kissed it. He called her Ada once more. He went down the stairs of the boarding house and out into Geary Street, and she closed the door of her room and stood with her back against it for a long time. In the week that followed, she saw him 3 more times. The meetings were short and formal. He was packing. He had bureau business to settle. He had, she understood, been writing letters to Delaware that he did not show her, and receiving letters from Delaware that he did not show her either. She did not ask to see them. She watched the letters come and go, and she kept the map of Delaware clear in her mind, and she said nothing. On the morning of his departure, which was the morning of March 9th, 1898, she went with him to the ferry because he was travelling east from Oakland, and the ferry across the bay was the first leg of his journey. They took the ferry-building terminal on Market Street. They rowed across the bay together in the early light. The bay was grey that morning, and a thin fog still lay on the water, though the sun was coming up behind the eastern hills, and the gulls followed the ferry in their usual indifferent lines, and the two of them stood together at the rail with his trunk beside them on the deck and did not say very much. Oakland at the other end, the train station of the Southern Pacific with its long platforms and its iron shed roof. The eastbound train stood on the platform, already attended by porters, the long dark line of Pullman cars and baggage cars, and the locomotive at the head whose stack was putting up a thin black rope of smoke into the cool morning air. There were perhaps 100 people on the platform, some travelling, some saying goodbye. A family was seeing off a young man in uniform. An older woman was embracing her son. Porters were calling in their unhurried rhythm. A conductor was walking the length of the train with a lantern still burning from the early hour, though the sun was well up by then. Cordelia and Dunning walked the length of the platform together. They reached his car. The porter took his trunk up the steps. Dunning turned to her. The thing that happened next, the scene on the platform, is the one piece of the record of their affair that a number of witnesses noticed, because it was the kind of scene that platforms in large stations were used to, and that travellers nearby would look up at and then look down from, half out of courtesy and half out of the long habit of the American public life of that period, it which was not yet accustomed to open displays of emotion from respectable-looking women. She wept. She wept openly. She did not cry out. She did not cling to him. She simply stood there on the platform in her dark walking costume and her small hat, with her gloved hand folded at her waist, and her tears ran down her face in a steady, unembarrassed way, as though she had decided that if he was going to leave her, he would leave her seeing what his leaving cost, and she would not spare him the sight of it. He did not know what to do. He was not a man who had ever known what to do with a woman's tears, because his whole talent had lain in the managing of women's hopes, which is a different business. He took her hands. He said something in a low voice, had some small formula of affection and reassurance that he had used before and that he did not this time mean. He kissed her on the forehead. He told her to take care of herself. He stepped up onto the train. He did not look back. The train began to move perhaps 3 minutes later. The porters swung up into their cars. The conductor gave his signal. The whistle sounded twice, the short warning and the longer call, and the driving wheels began their slow turn, and the long line of Pullmans began to move past the platform, slowly at first and then less slowly, and the window of his compartment passed her at a walking pace, and then at a running pace, and then was gone, and the last of the cars went by, and the rear of the train receded down the yard and into the curve beyond. And she was left standing on the platform with the porters now bending to their next arrivals and the other passengers dispersing toward the city and the long iron shed of the station echoing with its ordinary morning noise. She stood for perhaps 10 minutes. She did not move. A porter passed her once and glanced at her, and went on, because a porter in a great railway station in 1898 knew when to glance and when to keep walking, and he had seen women weeping on platforms before. At last she turned. She walked back down the platform. She went out of the station. She took the streetcar down to the ferry building. She took the ferry back across the bay. She rode it standing at the rail, looking out at the water, and the fog had lifted by the time the boat reached San Francisco, and the city lay ahead of her in its full morning light. The hills and the masts and the warehouses along the Embarcadero and the rising streets behind them, and she looked at the city she had lived in for 10 years as though she were seeing it from a great distance. She got off the ferry. She walked up Market Street. She did not stop at any of the cafes. She walked the long blocks home to the boarding house in the full daylight, and she climbed the stairs to her room, and she went in and she closed the door, and she did not come out for the rest of that day. What she did in that room over the hours of that long March afternoon was never recorded, because she did not speak of it afterward and no one was with her, and so it belongs to the small private hours of her life that the records does not reach. It is reasonable to suppose that she wept further, because a woman who weeps on a platform has usually not finished weeping. It is reasonable to suppose that she looked at herself in the tall pier glass in the corner of the room, because she had spent her adult life looking at herself in that glass, and it would have been strange of her to stop that afternoon. It is reasonable to suppose that she sat at her writing desk at some point in the afternoon and took out a sheet of paper and wrote something, or tried to write something, because she was a woman who had always turned to paper in her difficult hours. What is certain is that she did not write to him in Puerto Rico, though she had the address. She did not write to him at all. She had understood in some clear place in herself that her letter-writing days, so far as John Preston Dunning was concerned, were over. And it is also certain that at some point in the weeks that followed that March afternoon, in the slow, quiet interval between his departure and her July visit to her friend Mrs. Ruff in Stockton, she arrived at the plan. The plan was not sudden. It did not arrive in a single stroke. It grew, as such plans grow, out of the map she had been keeping in her mind for 2 years, the map of the wife in Delaware and the father who was a former congressman, and the small daughter and the friend named Mrs. Corby, and the fondness for candy. The map had been a passive thing while she had still had Dunning. It became, when she no longer had him, an active thing. She began to walk around it in her mind. She began to consider its routes. She began to consider what might be sent down those routes, and from what address, and in what package, and signed with what name. By the late spring of 1898, while the armies of the United States were embarking for Cuba, and her former lover was filing dispatches from the decks of steamers in the Caribbean, Cordelia Botkin, in her room on Geary Street in San Francisco, had arrived at the design of the thing she was going to do. She had not yet bought the candy. She had not yet visited the drugstore. She had not yet written the note. But she had decided. The rest, through the long, warm weeks of June and July, was only preparation. Chapter 8. Market Street. Market Street ran from the waterfront to the far hills in a single broad diagonal, and in the summer of 1898 it was the main artery of the city's commercial life. Cable cars ran up it in both directions, streetcars ran alongside them, horse traffic clogged its intersections, and the sidewalks were wide and kept up and were walked, on any weekday at midday, by clerks and shopgirls and lawyers and bankers and messenger boys and the ordinary steady crowd of a city that was at that hour very much at work. The great department stores rose along it, the City of Paris and the White House and the Emporium, and between them were the smaller establishments of the street, the stationers and the cigar merchants and the optical shops and the confectioners and the druggists, each with its painted sign above the door and its window dressed carefully for the passing eye. On the morning of July 31st, 1898, Cordelia Botkin walked down Market Street in a costume of light summer silk, with her parasol closed because the morning fog had not yet burned off, and her gloved hands crossed at her waist, and her small hat set at the angle her hairdresser had set it at the previous afternoon. She walked at the pace of a woman who had errands but was not in a hurry about any of them. She passed the City of Paris, where she had bought the handkerchief some days earlier. She passed the Emporium. She passed the offices of two of the city's newspapers, one of which would, in a few months, print her photograph on its front page. Her first stop that morning was the candy store of George Hos. The store stood on Market Street in a modest storefront between two larger establishments, and it was of the kind that a San Francisco confectioner of the period kept, which is to say a long narrow room with a marble-top counter on one side and glass cases on the other, and the smell of sugar and chocolate and vanilla in the air, and the soft overhead gaslight burning even in the daytime because the front windows were dressed with display pieces that kept out most of the daylight. The cases held the goods of the house in careful rows, chocolate creams and oblong bonbons and chocolate drops covered in sugary sprinkles, and peppermints and buttercreams and nougats in small paper cups, and the larger pieces, the solid chocolate animals and the ribbon candy coils, were laid out on the small paper doilies in the shop's better cases nearer the window. Behind the counter, two young women in white aprons attended the customers. Their names were Sylvia Heaney and Kitty Dittmer, and they had worked at the store together for some months, and they knew its stock and its customers in the way a good shop clerk knows these things. Cordelia came in a little after 11. Yeah, the shop was not busy at that hour. The morning rush had passed. She approached the counter, and she spoke to Miss Heaney, who came forward first, and she explained what she wanted with the precise manner of a customer who has thought about her purchase before arriving. She wanted a selection of chocolates, she said, for a gift. She wanted them placed in a fancy white box. She was particular, though, about the box. The box was not to carry the store's name. She did not want the Hos stamp on the lid or on the inside. She preferred a plain white box with a simple decorative script, something that could have come from any good confectioner. And the box, she added, was not to be filled completely to the top. She had another article she wished to place inside it herself, and she needed the space for it. Miss Heaney considered the request. It was not a usual request, but it was not an extraordinary one. Customers sometimes wanted plain boxes for gifts, particularly when they did not wish the recipient to know the origin of the purchase, and the shop had plain boxes on hand for just such occasions. She went to the back and returned with a white oblong box, decorated along the lid with the word bonbons in gold script, in a style generic enough that it could indeed have come from any number of confectioners in the city. She showed it to Cordelia. Cordelia nodded. Miss Heaney and Miss Dittmer together selected the chocolates. They laid the rows of chocolate creams first, then the oblong bonbons, then the chocolate drops with the sugary sprinkles, and they left a space of perhaps an inch at one end of the box as the customer had specified. They tied the box with a ribbon of pink satin, which the shop kept for its summer trade, because pink satin in July was a pretty ribbon for a gift. They placed the tied box in a paper bag. Cordelia paid in cash, which was unremarkable. She took the bag, thanked them, and left. Miss Heaney and Miss Dittmer would both remember her clearly in the months that followed. They would remember her particularly because of the insistence on the plain box, which had struck them as odd at the time and stranger in retrospect, and because of the care with which she had examined the lid before accepting it. They would remember her clothing and her manner, and the small details of her face and her speech, and they would give this recollection in time from a witness stand. Her second stop that morning was the Owl drugstore, which stood farther down Market Street at the corner of 7th. The Owl was one of the larger druggists in the city, and its storefront was a familiar sight, and its business was brisk through the whole of the working day. Inside, the shop was longer and higher ceilinged than the candy store, with the tall wooden shelves of the 19th century druggist rising on every wall and rows of brown glass bottles with their printed paper labels on every shelf, and the long front counter with its brass scales and its apothecary drawers and its bound registers. Cordelia came in and went to the front counter. She waited her turn. When her turn came, she spoke to the clerk behind the counter, whose name was Frank Gray, and she asked for arsenic, 2 ounces. Mr. Gray was an experienced clerk. He had worked the counter at the Owl for some years, and he knew the poison laws of the state of California, and he knew the habits of his customers, and he knew, above all, that a respectable-looking woman in a silk walking costume did not usually come into his shop and ask for 2 ounces of arsenic across the counter in the middle of the morning. He asked her, in the polite manner of his profession, what she wanted it for. She told him she wanted it to bleach a straw hat. It was not an unreasonable answer. Arsenic had a long history of use in millinery. Straw hats of the period were often treated with various chemical preparations to keep them white through a season, and housewives who trimmed their own hats sometimes kept small quantities of arsenic for the purpose. But Mr. Gray, who knew his business, understood that there were better and safer preparations for that use, and he said so. And he suggested 2 or 3 alternatives. He named them. He pointed to the shelf behind him where they stood. He explained in the patient voice of a man who had explained such things before that these preparations would bleach a straw hat perfectly well, and that they carried none of the dangers of pure arsenic, and that, importantly, they would not require her to sign the poison register, because the state of California in 1898 required every purchase of arsenic to be entered in a register at the point of sale, with the buyer's name and address and signature, and many customers preferred to avoid the formality. She refused his suggestions. She said, pleasantly but firmly, that she wanted arsenic, and that she did not wish to be troubled with alternatives. Mr. Gray considered her for a moment. He was not obligated to refuse the sale. The law permitted it, provided the register was properly kept. He brought out the register from beneath the counter. He turned it to the current page. He took down a brown glass bottle from the shelf behind him, and he measured out 2 ounces of the white powder onto a small piece of paper, and he folded the paper into a packet, and he set it on the counter between them. He handed her the pen. She signed. The name she wrote was Mrs. Botkin. It was not her name. It was a near approximation of her name, close enough that a clerk reading it later might think he had misread it, and different enough that a casual search of the register would not identify her. Mr. Gray watched her write it. He did not object. He was not required to verify a signature. He was only required to record it. He noted the address she gave him, which was also not her address. He took her payment. He handed her the packet. She placed the packet in her handbag next to the paper bag from the candy store, and she thanked him, and she turned and walked out of the shop into Market Street, and she went home. Mr. Gray, like the candy clerks, would remember her clearly. He would remember her insistence. He would remember the refusal of the alternatives. He would remember the face of the woman who had signed his register with a name that was not her name, and he would give this recollection, when the time came for such recollections to be taken down, with the same plain certainty that Miss Heaney and Miss Dittmer would give theirs. A shop clerk in a city of 350,000 people sees many faces in the course of his working year, but he remembers the faces of the customers who have insisted on the wrong thing, because the wrong thing in a shop is a small violation of the expected rhythm, and it fixes itself in the memory, the way an irregular heartbeat fixes itself in the listening ear of a doctor. She went home. She went up Geary Street. She climbed the stairs of the boarding house to her room. She closed the door behind her. She set the paper bag from the candy store on the small writing desk by the window, and she set the packet from the druggist beside it. She took off her hat. She took off her gloves. She sat down at the desk. The work that followed is the work that no witness saw, because she did it alone in her room over the course of the next several days, and it is the work whose exact particulars had to be reconstructed later by chemists and investigators from the evidence of the finished box. But the shape of it can be reasonably described, because the methods by which a woman of the period would have laced a quantity of chocolates with arsenic in a private room were not complicated, and the Owl druggist's packet, and the box from Hos, and the table in the room, and the time available together tell the story plainly enough. She opened the box. She untied the pink ribbon carefully, because she intended to use it again, and set it aside on the desk. She lifted the lid. She looked at the chocolates in their neat rows. She took a small knife, probably a penknife of the kind a woman of her period kept for sharpening a pencil or slitting a letter, and she lifted one of the chocolate creams out of its paper cup. She turned it in her fingers. She cut into it. She worked arsenic into the opening. She closed the candy around it and smoothed it and set it back in its paper cup. She did the same with the next chocolate, and the next. She worked through the box patiently, over some hours or perhaps spread across some days, lacing each piece with a quantity of the white powder. The state chemist of Delaware, Dr. T.R. Wolfe, who would later analyze what remained of the box, would find a quantity of arsenic in each of the 3 pieces he examined that together could have killed 4 adults. He would find in one of the pieces a chunk of arsenic embedded in the candy that was, in his own measured phrase, as large as a pea. Whoever had prepared the chocolates had not been concerned with subtlety of dose. They had been concerned only that the dose be sufficient, and then more than sufficient, and then more than that. The arsenic had not been added as a warning or as a caution or as a gesture. It had been added to kill. When the lacing was done, she closed the box. She took from her desk the handkerchief she had purchased at the city of Paris, a fine cotton square that was a plausible small gift from a friend, and she folded it, and she laid it on top of the chocolates in the space she had asked the clerks to leave for it. She did not notice that the store tag from the city of Paris was still attached to the handkerchief by its small string. It was a tag of the kind that came stitched in lightly, and that customers routinely removed at home before wrapping a gift, and the oversight was not the kind of thing that a careful person would be expected to miss, but she missed it. The tag stayed. She took a small slip of paper from her desk. She took up her pen. She wrote in her firm feminine hand the 6 words that would be the signature of the entire enterprise. With love to yourself and baby, Mrs. C. She folded the slip. She placed it inside the box on top of the handkerchief. She lowered the lid. She took up the pink ribbon and tied it, as the clerks had tied it, in a flat satin bow on the top of the box, and she set the box on the desk while she prepared the outer wrapping. She laid out a sheet of brown paper. She set the box in the middle of it. She folded the paper around the box in the neat overlapping method by which parcels were wrapped in that period, and she secured the folds with string, and she wrote in the same firm hand as the note, the address on the outside of the wrapping. Mrs. John P. Dunning, Dover, Delaware. She wrote the return address, because parcels without return addresses were sometimes refused by postmasters, and she wrote a San Francisco post office box as the return, because she did not want her own street address on the paper. She carried the parcel out of her room. She went down the stairs of the boarding house. She walked down Geary to Market, and along Market to the foot of the street, where the ferry building stood with its great clock tower, and inside the building was the ferry post office, which handled much of the city's outgoing mail because it was convenient to the shipping. She went in, she waited her turn at the window. She set the parcel on the counter. The clerk at the window that morning was a man named John Dunnigan. He was an ordinary postal clerk in an ordinary morning's work, and he took the parcel and weighed it on his scales and calculated the postage and wrote out the slip, and he glanced at the address as he did so. The name on the address caught his eye, because it was Dunning, and his own surname was Dunnigan, and the similarity of the 2 names was the kind of small coincidence that a postal clerk noticed and filed away in the small spare corner of his mind where such things went. He stamped the parcel. He handed Cordelia her receipt. He set the parcel in the outgoing bin, and she walked out of the ferry building into the summer sun on the Embarcadero. The bay lay ahead of her, blue under the midday light, with the ferries crossing and the ships at their berths. She turned up Market Street. She walked the long blocks home. The parcel lay in the bin for perhaps an hour. Then it was carried with the rest of the outgoing mail onto a railway postal car at the Oakland yards. Then it was carried east, across the Sierra Nevada, across the Great Basin, across the Rockies, across the long flat plains of Nebraska and Iowa, across the Mississippi, across Illinois and Indiana and Ohio and Pennsylvania, through the long low country of Maryland and the upper shore of the Chesapeake, and at last into the small brick post office in Dover, Delaware, where on the morning of August the 9th it was sorted with the rest of the incoming mail and placed on a cart for delivery, and carried by a letter carrier up State Street, and set down upon the hall table at 210 South State Street, among the other mail of the day. Cordelia by then was not in San Francisco. She had left the city some days earlier, once the parcel was in the mail, and had gone north to the small town of St. Helena in Napa County, where she had taken a room in a hotel on the main street, and where she would spend the weeks of early August in a quiet that was neither flight nor concealment, but simply absence. She had no need to flee, because no one yet suspected her. She had no need to hide, because no one yet knew her name. She had only gone, as a woman of her means might go, to take the country air for a little while in the early summer. She walked in the afternoons along the dry roads of the Napa Valley. She read in the evenings in the hotel parlour. She slept well. She was still there on August 11th when her sister-in-law died, and still there on August 12th when Mary Elizabeth Dunning died, and still there for some days afterward, in the hotel with its narrow porch and its white-painted railings, in the small wine country town that had no part in the story she had sent 3,000 miles away, and whose quiet she used now as the final ingredient of the thing she had done. Chapter 9. The Long Ride East. The parcel that crossed the continent in the first days of August 1898 travelled on a railway that had been finished less than 30 years before, and that had in its short life already begun to change the scale of American crime. A letter mailed in San Francisco on a Saturday arrived in Dover on a Tuesday morning, and the country that had once been too large to be imagined as a single place had become, for the purposes of mail and money and murder, a single place after all. The ferry post office on Market Street and the small brick post office in Dover, Delaware, stood in the same postal system, and that system ran a continuous line between them, and anything that could be set down in a box in San Francisco could, within a week, be lifted out of a hall table in Delaware. The parcel rode in a railway postal car, sorted and resorted at every junction by clerks who worked in the narrow aisles of moving cars with the mail sacks swaying around them, and it crossed the Sierra Nevada in the high cold air of the passes, where the snow sheds covered the rails for miles at a time, and the short summer nights in the mountains were cool enough that a traveller in a sleeping berth pulled his blanket up. It crossed the Great Basin through a country of salt flats and sagebrush, where the train ran for hours without a stop. It crossed the Rockies in a long, slow climb and a long, slow descent. It came down onto the plains, and the plains took it east through Nebraska, past the town of Brownsville, where the sender had been born 44 years earlier, through Omaha and Lincoln and across the Missouri on the Iron Bridge at Council Bluffs, and then across the long flat corn country of Iowa in the full summer heat. It crossed the Mississippi at Rock Island. It crossed Illinois. It crossed Indiana. And it crossed Ohio. It crossed the Alleghenies into Pennsylvania. It came down into the tidewater country of Maryland. It reached Delaware on the night of the 8th, and was sorted at the Wilmington post office in the dark hours of that night, and was put on the southbound bag for Dover at dawn, and was carried the last 40 miles in the small hours, and was delivered in the mid-morning of the 9th. John Dunnigan, the clerk at the ferry post office who had taken the parcel across the counter, did not think of it again for some weeks. He went home to his wife that evening. He went to work the next day. He processed the next week's mail. He remembered the parcel, when at last the San Francisco detectives came to his window to ask after it, because he had noted at the time the small coincidence of the addressee's surname Dunning and his own, Dunnigan, and the kind of clerk who noted such things was the kind of clerk who remembered them. He remembered the woman, too. He remembered her fell and her clothing and the parcel in brown paper and the address in a firm feminine hand, and he said so when he was asked. But all of that came later. In the first week of August, he was only a clerk at his window, and the parcel was only one of some thousands he had handled that summer, and it rode the rails east without anyone in particular attending to it. Because there was no reason for anyone in particular to attend to it, because murder by mail was not yet a thing the Postal Service had learned to watch for. The parcel arrived, the box was opened, the chocolates were eaten, the sisters were buried, and on the afternoon of August 14th, while the Pennington family was returning from the grave, a telegram addressed to John Preston Dunning, Associated Press, care of the United States Army Forces in Puerto Rico, was handed in at the Dover Telegraph Office by John Brown Pennington, the grandfather of the dead woman's daughter, and the father-in-law of the man the telegram was addressed to. It travelled by wire down the coast to Baltimore, and from there to Washington, and from there to New York, where the cable offices handled the transatlantic traffic, and from there across the undersea cable to Havana, and from there by the coastal lines to Ponce in Puerto Rico, and at last into the hands of an Associated Press runner who carried it to Dunning, who was at that moment writing a dispatch on the condition of American troops in the interior of the island. The telegram was brief. It said that his wife and her sister were dead of poisoning. It said that the poison had come in a box of candy. It said that his presence in Delaware was required immediately. He read it twice. He set it down on the table. He did not, the runner would later say, show any particular reaction, though his face went, in the runner's words, a little grey at the edges. He finished the sentence he had been writing. He rose. He told the bureau man in Ponce that he was leaving at once. He packed his small travelling case. He boarded the first available ship to New York, which was a red D-line steamer called the Philadelphia, and he rode the 5 days' passage in his cabin with his meals brought in and his door shut because he was a reporter travelling under the weight of his own story, and he had already understood. Then by the second day of the passage, the shape of the thing he was about to be asked. The ship came into New York Harbor on the morning of August 24th. The newspapers had been running the story of the Dover poisoning for 10 days by then, in the way the newspapers of that period ran such stories, which is to say with every detail that could be verified, and a number that could not, and the name of the Associated Press correspondent whose wife had been the principal victim had been in the papers since the second day. Reporters from every paper in New York were waiting on the dock when the Philadelphia came in. Dunning came down the gangplank in a dark suit and a soft hat. His case was carried by a porter behind him. The reporters closed in on him before he had reached the bottom of the gangplank. They called out questions. They asked him what he knew. They asked him whom he suspected. They asked him whether it was true, as the Dover papers had already begun to hint, that the hand on the anonymous letters his father-in-law had been collecting for a year matched the hand on the note that had come with the candy. He stopped on the gangplank. He turned. He looked at the men with their notebooks and their pencils. He said a name. He said the name clearly, in the plain voice of a man who had decided during the 5 days of his passage that he was not going to pretend in public to a discretion he had not practiced in private. He said the name once, and then again when a reporter near the back asked him to repeat it, and then he went on down the gangplank and into a waiting carriage and was driven away, Cordelia Botkin. That by that evening the name was on the front page of every paper in New York, and by the following morning it was on the front page of every paper in the country. The story, which had been the story of 2 poisoned women in a small Delaware town, became overnight the story of a San Francisco adulteress who had killed her lover's wife across 3,000 miles of American continent, and the newspapers, which had been waiting for a story of exactly this kind, took it up with the full and practiced appetite of their profession. In Dover, Pennington received copies of the New York papers the following day. He read them without comment. He had already supplied the name to the San Francisco police 2 weeks earlier in his original telegram because he had not needed his son-in-law's public announcement to know what he knew. Thus the papers were confirming now what his folder had been quietly telling him for a year. In San Francisco, the police had been at work. A captain of detectives named Isaiah Lees had been assigned to the case the day Pennington's telegram had come in, and he had begun methodically the work of building the evidence. His men had gone to the drugstore on Market Street and had interviewed Frank Gray. They had shown him photographs of various women. Mr. Gray had identified Cordelia Botkin from a photograph. They had gone to the candy store of George Hos and had interviewed Miss Heaney and Miss Dittmer. The 2 young women had identified her as well. They had gone to the ferry post office and had interviewed John Dunnigan, who had identified her also. They had interviewed Elmira Ruff. At the Stockton friend whose questions about poisons and the mailing of registered packages had seemed peculiar in late July, and who now understood, with a cold clarity, what those questions had been about. They had interviewed the matron of the boarding house on Geary Street, who had not known anything of substance but had known where Cordelia kept her rooms and had confirmed that she had been in them during the days of the parcel's preparation and had been absent in the days after its mailing. The police had also been reading her letters. They had obtained, through the cooperation of the Pennington household in Delaware, the full folder of anonymous letters that had accumulated over the preceding year, and they had brought samples of Cordelia's known handwriting from her friends in San Francisco, and they had laid the 2 bodies of writing beside each other in the offices of the San Francisco police, and they had confirmed with the plain certainty of the naked eye what Pennington had already confirmed in his study. By the time Dunning arrived in New York on August 24th and spoke the name on the gangplank, the San Francisco police had already drawn the wire from their department to Napa County to ask after a woman traveling in St. Helena, and had already received word that the woman was in a hotel on the main street, and had already sent 2 detectives north by rail to the town. The detectives travelled on the 25th. They arrived in St. Helena in the late afternoon. They went to the hotel. They learned that Mrs. Botkin had left that morning for Stockton, where she had gone to visit her husband Welcome at the family house. The detectives wired back to San Francisco. The San Francisco office wired Stockton. The Stockton police, acting on the wire, went to the house of Welcome Botkin on the morning of August 26th with a warrant for his wife's arrest on a charge of murder. She was in an upstairs bedroom when they arrived. She was, in the detail that would be repeated for decades afterward, in the middle of changing her clothes for the 2nd or 3rd time that day, because it was her habit to change her clothes several times a day, and she had not broken the habit on account of travelling. She came down the stairs at the request of the officers. She received the warrant in the front parlour of the house. She did not resist. She did not protest. She sank onto the sofa and made a sound that the officers present would later describe as a moan. She said, in a low, even voice, and with a phrasing that the papers would reprint in every state of the Union within 48 hours, the chagrin is past. The horror is over. I have suffered all the humiliation. I am ready. She asked permission to pack a trunk for her stay in jail. The officers allowed it. She went upstairs with a matron who'd been brought along for that purpose. She packed for perhaps an hour. She came down with a trunk of gowns and accessories and hats and small items of toilet that was heavy enough that 2 deputies were required to carry it down the staircase of the Botkin house in Stockton. And the image of that descent, the 2 men straining at the handles and the woman in her walking costume coming down the stairs behind them with her gloved hand on the banister, would become one of the fixed pictures of the case, and would be redrawn for the papers in many versions by many artists in the weeks that followed. She was taken to the Stockton jail, and from there, the next day, by train to San Francisco, and placed in the city prison. She was photographed upon her arrival. She posed for the photograph, which was perhaps the last thing she did in the ordinary habit of her life that would not be read afterward as evidence against her. The photograph ran in the papers the next morning. She was wearing a dark dress. Her hair was neatly pinned. Her gaze was direct. She was looking slightly to the left of the camera, in the 3/4 pose she had always preferred, and her small mouth was set in the composed line of a woman who had been photographed 100 times before, and who was not going to alter her habits on account of where she was standing. The trial would come in the winter, but the arrest, the trunk, the sofa, the quoted sentence, the photograph and the name, Cordelia Botkin, had already, by the last week of August, passed from the small private country of her life into the public property of the American newspaper-reading public. She would not get it back. In Delaware, Pennington put away the folder. He had no further need of it. The thing it had been kept for had come. Chapter 10. San Quentin. The trial of Cordelia Botkin opened in San Francisco on December the 9th, 1898, in the criminal court of Judge Carroll Cook, and it took the better part of a month to conclude. It was a new kind of trial, because it was the first trial in the history of American law in which a court had to decide a question that no court had decided before. It was a question that the newspapers of the period, reaching for the shape of a thing they had not seen before, put plainly. Where does a crime occur when the act and the consequence are 3,000 miles apart? The act had been in California. The hand had cut the chocolates. The hand had signed the note. The hand had wrapped the parcel. The hand had carried it to the ferry post office. All of that had happened in the city of San Francisco, in the state of California. The consequence had been in Delaware. The 2 women had died on a porch and in a downstairs bedroom in a house on South State Street in Dover, in the state of Delaware. The bodies had been buried in a churchyard in Dover, and the grief had settled in Dover. The crime, if a crime was measured by the place where the pain of it was felt, had occurred 3,000 miles from where the hand had worked. The 2 states had no precedent for dividing such a crime between them. The defense, which was led by an able San Francisco lawyer named George Knight, argued that a California court had no jurisdiction to try a woman for a murder whose victim had died in Delaware. It argued that if a trial were to be held at all, it had to be held in Dover, before a Delaware jury, in a Delaware courtroom, under Delaware law. The prosecution, led by the district attorney of San Francisco, argued the opposite. It argued that the crime, in every material respect that a California court could reach, had been committed in California. The poison had been purchased in California. That the candy had been bought in California. The lacing had been done in California. The parcel had been mailed in California. The design, the preparation, the delivery into the postal system, all of these had occurred within the jurisdiction of a San Francisco court, and a San Francisco court could try the person who had done them, because what she had done there. Judge Cook ruled for the prosecution. He ruled that a California court had jurisdiction to try a California resident for a California act, even if the victim had died beyond the state's borders. His ruling was an important ruling, and it would be studied and cited for many years afterward in the American legal literature on extradition and on the jurisdictional reach of state courts. But the case itself for the public was not about the ruling. It was about the woman on the stand. Cordelia was brought into court each day in the clothes she had taken from her trunk, which had been held for her at the jail, and from which she selected her costume each morning in the manner of her accustomed habit. She wore dark silks and neat hats, and she carried small handkerchiefs, and she sat at the defense table with her gloved hands folded before her, and she listened to the evidence against her with a composure that the press found variously admirable and sinister. She did not testify in her own defense. because the defense strategy was to challenge the prosecution's case rather than to present her own story, and because her own story, if she had told it, would have required her to account for a great many things that neither she nor her lawyers wished to account for. And the prosecution built its case on this evidence the San Francisco detectives had gathered in August. Miss Heaney and Miss Dittmer testified from the witness stand. Frank Gray testified. John Dunnigan testified. Elmira Ruff testified. A handwriting expert testified to the identity of the hand on the anonymous letters and the hand on the candy box note. Dr. T.R. Wolfe of Delaware College testified to the quantity of arsenic in the remaining chocolates. The folder of anonymous letters from the Pennington household was entered into evidence. The handkerchief with the City of Paris tag was entered into evidence. The pink ribbon was entered into evidence. The note itself, with its 6 words in her hand, was entered into evidence and was shown to the jury on the afternoon of the 3rd day of the trial, and was passed along the rail of the jury box from hand to hand in the silence of the courtroom. John Preston Dunning did not testify. He was in the courtroom for several of the days of the trial, sitting at the back in a dark suit, and he was stared at a good deal by the reporters and by the spectators in the gallery, and he did not once meet Cordelia's eye, and she did not once look at him. They had not spoken since the platform at Oakland in March. They would not speak again. The jury went out on the last day of the year. They returned on December the 31st, 1898, with a verdict of guilty of murder in the 1st degree. Judge Cook sentenced her to life imprisonment, which was, under California law of that period, the penalty for murder by poisoning when the death sentence was not imposed, and the death sentence was not imposed in her case because the jury had recommended against it. She received the sentence standing in a dark dress with her hands at her sides. She was transferred from the San Francisco jail to the women's section of San Quentin prison, which stood on a point of land jutting into San Pablo Bay across the water from the city she had lived in for 15 years. The prison had been built in the 1850s on what had then been a rough coast of marsh and pasture, and it had grown over the decades that followed into the large, grim stone institution that it was by the end of the century. Its walls rose above the water. Its main gate faced inland toward the low hills of Marin County. Its yards were gravel, its cells were small and of pale stone, and its corridors were long and echoing, and its women's section, which was a small wing of the larger prison, was kept separate from the men by the usual arrangements of that period, a locked door and a set of stairs and a matron at the head of the stairs. The first verdict was, in time, overturned on a technical ground, and Cordelia was return-tried, and on the second trial she was again convicted, and the conviction held. She remained at San Quentin through the last years of the century and the first years of the next. She was a quiet prisoner. She did not cause trouble. She corresponded with a small circle of friends on the outside, none of whom had been particularly close to her in her San Francisco years, but who had, in the way that notoriety sometimes attracts new correspondents, written to her after the trial. She read. She sewed a little, in the way the matrons required of the women prisoners. So she kept her hair pinned, she kept her manners. The prison authorities, for a period of several years, permitted her a degree of latitude that later commentators would find remarkable, and which was not well understood even at the time. She was allowed to take her meals, for some stretches, outside the women's wing. She was allowed to receive visitors in rooms that other prisoners did not receive visitors in. When the practices came to light in a prison investigation in 1906, the warden was dismissed, and the arrangements were ended, and Cordelia was returned to the ordinary routine of the women's wing for the remainder of her sentence. She did not see her husband welcome in those years. He did not come to the prison. He died in Stockton in the first decade of the new century, and Cordelia was not informed of his death for some weeks. And she did not see her son Beverly, or if she did, the visits are not in the record. She did not see John Preston Dunning. He did not write. He did not visit. He lived, through the years of her imprisonment, the various lives he had always been able to arrange for himself, and he did not make her a part of any of them, and she did not ask him to. She died at San Quentin on March 7th, 1910. She was 56 years old. The cause of death was given as a combination of melancholia and softening of the brain, which was the medical language of the period for a general decline of body and mind, and which in her case had set in over the last 2 years of her life and had progressed without reversal. She had been a prisoner for 11 years and some months. She had outlived her husband. She had outlived the 2 sisters she had killed. She had not outlived her lover, who would outlive her by a number of years, and who would give no statement at the news of her death, because by the time of her death the public memory of the case had faded somewhat, and no paper thought to ask him. She was buried in the prison cemetery at San Quentin, in a plain grave with a numbered stone. The cemetery was a small patch of ground outside the walls on a slope above the bay, where the prison buried its dead when no family came to claim them. Her family did not claim her. Her son had his own life by then in the country around Stockton, and he did not travel to the prison for the burial, and no stone with her name upon it was ever set over the grave. The number was the only marker. The grass grew over it in the following springs. The case of Botkin remained in the law books, and it became a standard reference in the American legal literature on interstate jurisdiction. Law students in the decades that followed read the case and the ruling and the arguments, and the name Botkin entered the vocabulary of the American courtroom as a technical term, a case one cited when the question of the place of a crime came up, which it did from time to time in new cases involving new technologies of communication, because the telephone and the automobile and later the airplane would each, in their own way, raise again the question that the candy box and the railway postal car had raised first. She had not intended to contribute anything to American law. She had intended only to kill a woman she had never met. But the law, which is patient and which finds its cases where it finds them, had taken her intention and made of it a precedent, and her name was written in the casebooks, where it has remained. In Dover, Delaware, the Pennington family continued in the house on South State Street for some years after the deaths of Mary and Ida. John Brown Pennington lived until 1900. He did not marry again. He did not, in his remaining years, speak publicly of his daughter's death, and he did not, in the small private gatherings of his house, permit the subject to be raised in his presence. He died quietly in his own bed, in the same upstairs room where his daughter Mary had died 2 years before, and he was buried beside her in the Christchurch cemetery, and the three graves, Mary's and Ida's and his, lay together in the same plot under the elm that had stood over the house throughout the summer of 1898, and that had cast its shade on the porch where the box had been opened. The box itself was destroyed in the years after the trial, as court evidence was destroyed when the need for it had passed. The pink ribbon, the handkerchief with its City of Paris tag, the note in the firm feminine hand, the remaining chocolates in their paper cups, all of these passed out of the physical record. What remained was paper, the court transcripts, the newspaper clippings, the folder of anonymous letters, which was eventually lost to the ordinary attritions of private archives and which has not surfaced in the 100 and more years since. The photographs of Cordelia, the many portraits she had sat for in her vanity, the faces she had composed for the camera in the studios of Market Street in the years when she had thought herself beloved, those survived and can still be looked at, and carry her likeness forward into the present in the careful three-quarter poses she arranged. In the small prison cemetery at San Quentin, in the slope above the bay, her grave is still there, or the earth that holds her is still there, though the numbered stone has long since been lost to weather and to the quiet erasure of institutional burial. The grass goes green in the wet winters and dry in the long summers. The bay lies below, the same bay she crossed on the ferry with Dunning in the clear morning of March 9th, 1898, when she had stood at the rail of the boat beside him, with his trunk at their feet and the gulls following in their long lines, and had not yet done what she had by that evening already begun to plan. Somewhere in Dover, in an ordinary house on an ordinary street, a pink ribbon lay for many years in a drawer, kept by the maid Anna, who had taken it from the porch table on the morning of August 10th while clearing the things of that afternoon, and who had not known at the time what it was, and had kept it only because it was pretty, and who had understood, in the weeks that followed it, what the ribbon had been part of, and had not been able, after that, to throw it away, and had not been able either to look at it, and so had put it in a drawer, where it lay for the rest of her long life, and where, in the ordinary way of such things, someone unknown to us eventually after her death threw it out. The elm on South State Street fell in a storm in the 1930s. Their house was sold and sold again, and at last was taken down. The porch boards were taken up, the lemonade pitcher, the wicker table, the rocking chairs, the small brass thermometer nailed to the kitchen door frame. All of those things passed through the hands of various owners and auctioneers and estate sales, and were scattered into the general household flow of the 20th century, and were unmade into the general household flow of the 20th century, and cannot now be located. Only the graves in Christchurch Cemetery, and the court case in the law books, and the name in the newspaper archives remain. The hour is late, wherever you are listening from tonight. The house on South State Street is no longer there. The porch is no longer there. The elm is no longer there. The box with its pink ribbon has been destroyed. The hand that wrote the 6 words lies in a numbered plot above the bay, with the grass over it and the stone lost. The women who died on the porch lie together in Delaware, with the stone of their father beside them. The man for whom all of it was done outlived them all and is buried somewhere of which the present record is uncertain, and his name, which was once on the front pages of every paper in the country, is now a name that must be looked up. With love to yourself and baby, Mrs. C. 6 words in a firm feminine hand on a slip of paper folded once, set down on a hall table on a hot August morning in 1898, on a small town street where the elm threw its shade, and the cicadas kept their long dry note, and the door of the house stood open to whatever the day would bring. Good night.